Good afternoon. My name is Dexter Enzile, and I am the Schulman Research Fellow for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. It's my honor today to introduce Reverend Dr. Tricia Miller, Senior Research Analyst at Cameron, my colleague, who will be speaking today about the meaning of Purim and what it teaches us about the importance of our actions in the face of great evil. Dr. Miller is uniquely suited to address this issue. She is a credentialed minister in the Assemblies of God and has a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California. And she wrote her dissertation on Christian anti-Semitism in relation to the book of Esther, the Megillah. She knows the whole Megillah. In her second book, titled Jews and Anti-Judaism in Esther and the Church, Dr. Miller reveals the relevance of the story of Esther to controversy over the existence of Israel and to the role that anti-Judaism plays in the debate over Israel in Christian churches. She wrote this book to expose the theological and historical errors at the root of anti-Jewish and anti-Israel narrative that has taken root in Christian churches in the modern world. And her goal is to strengthen evangelical support of Israel's right to exist and defend itself against those who seek its annihilation. And sadly, her research has become much more relevant in the past few years. She's going to speak today for about 25 minutes, and after her presentation, we're going to continue with a Q&A question and answer session with written questions. We want to hear from you. If you run your cursor along the bottom of your screen on Zoom, you'll see an icon for Q&A. Just click that button, and you'll be able to submit the questions during the talk. So let's begin. Good afternoon, Dr. Miller.
Thank you so much, Dexter. Thank you for that gracious invitation. And welcome to everyone who's joined us today for what we hope will be an enlightening discussion about the book of Esther and the holiday of Purim. Before we finish today, we'll see why Purim is relevant to the Christian faith, why it's meaningful for Christians that Jews in the ancient Persian Empire were saved from extermination almost 500 years before the birth of Jesus. We will also hopefully have an understanding of the role that we as Christians have to play in a world where anti-Semitism continues to intensify and the state of Israel faces increasing opposition to its very existence. And we will have discussed what Esther and Purim have to teach us about the need to take action in the face of evil. But first, we need some background information about the story. The holiday of Purim, which we're celebrating today, was instituted in the book of Esther and has been celebrated by the Jewish people every year since the time of Queen Esther, approximately 2,500 years ago. Every year, Jews all over the world read the entire story and rejoice over the deliverance of the Jews of ancient Persia from intended annihilation. Purim is celebrated in accordance with Esther 9:27-28, which states that the Jews of Persia committed themselves and their descendants to this annual commemoration, so that Purim shall never cease and the memory of it shall not perish. The holiday started last night. It's celebrated today, which is the 14th day of the month of Adar on the Hebrew calendar. That's the date specified for it in chapter 9 of Esther. But we get ahead of ourselves if we start by focusing on the holiday, because the celebration of Purim is at the end of the story, and it's only possible to celebrate because of the actions taken by Queen Esther and her uncle Mordecai in the context of great danger. So let's start at the beginning of the story, because Esther and Purim is not just about celebration, although that is certainly an important part. The story of Esther and Purim is about more than the holiday. It's also about a call to action in the face of evil, which in our context today includes an alarming rise in anti-Semitism and opposition to Israel's right to exist. Chapter 1 begins by identifying the king of Persia as the one who reigned over an empire that went from India to Ethiopia. It was the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. In the Hebrew, the king's name is Ahasuerus, which is written as Ahasuerus in most of your translations. To the Greek historians, this king was known as Xerxes, and that's how he's referred to in historical accounts outside the biblical text. So Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus, and Xerxes are all the same person, and this king was the most powerful man in the world at the time. We're told that the throne of the kingdom was in the city of Shushan, also known as Susa, and that in the 3rd year of his reign, the king gave a banquet for all his officials and nobles that lasted 180 days. That sounds bizarre, but this extensive kind of partying is verified by Greek historians who documented the excessive drinking practices of King Xerxes. Esther 1:10 tells us that when the king was, quote, merry with wine, in other words, he was drunk, he ordered his eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti to the banquet so he could display her beauty to all his male guests. In verse 12, we learn that Vashti refused to come and be put on display in front of a bunch of drunken men. After much discussion among the men as to how to deal with the queen's refusal, the decision was made that Vashti was to be banished and the king should seek another queen. Chapter 2 begins by describing the plan to gather all the young virgins in the kingdom so the king can choose a new queen. This set of circumstances, the reason I've explained this, beginning with Queen Vashti's refusal to come to the king's banquet, this is what paved the way for Esther to become queen. The young women in the kingdom were taken to the palace forcefully. They were rounded up against their will and subjected to extensive beauty treatments that would make them presentable for the king, who would then decide which woman he wanted as his new queen. In chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, we are introduced to Mordecai and Esther. We learn that Mordecai is a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. We also learn that Mordecai had adopted his younger relative Esther because she was an orphan. According to the text, Esther has 2 names. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, which means myrtle. However, the name she was to be known by in the Persian court was Esther. In Hebrew, the name Esther comes from the verb that means to hide. Esther means I will be hidden. So in 2:10, we read that Mordecai told Esther to keep her identity as a Jew a secret when she was taken into the king's palace, suggesting that Mordecai believed it was dangerous for her to be known as a Jew. Chapter 2 describes the process Esther went through in preparation for being taken to the king, and before the end of chapter 2, she's chosen as queen. At the beginning of chapter 3, we're introduced to Haman, or Haman in Hebrew, and he's identified as an Agagite who was appointed by the king to be over all the other officials. It's significant that Mordecai is introduced as a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, and Haman is introduced as an Agagite, which means he was a descendant of King Agag of the Amalekites. Maybe we'll have time to discuss this more in the Q&A time, but for now, it's enough to say that the biblical author is letting us know that these 2 men are natural enemies. In fact, they're mortal enemies, based on the bad history between the Israelites and the Amalekites from the time that Israel traveled through the wilderness after the Exodus, and the bad history between King Saul of the tribe of Benjamin, from whom Mordecai is descended, and King Agag of the Amalekites. Well, immediately after being introduced to Haman, we're told that everyone was supposed to bow to him by order of the king, but Mordecai refused to bow. And that's another whole study as to why he did. But Mordecai's refusal to bow infuriated Haman, and in his anger, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews in the Persian Empire. He decided it wasn't enough for him to get back at Mordecai. Well, of course, in order to do this, he had to have authorization from the king. So we see in chapter 3, verse 8, that Haman brought a false accusation to the king to convince him to issue a decree that called for the destruction of the Jews. Throughout history, from the time of Haman until today, false accusations have been made against the Jews to justify all kinds and any kind of persecution against them. In 3:8, Haman told the king that there was a certain people scattered throughout the kingdom who had different laws than all other people, and that this people did not obey the king's laws. Therefore, it was in the king's best interest that this people be destroyed. It's interesting to note that Haman never told the king the identity of the people he sought to have destroyed. And again, that's another story as to maybe why he didn't do that. But I need to point out here that Haman's accusation is not supported by any historical or textual evidence. And in fact, it's refuted by the fact that the text says Mordecai had a position in the palace gate, which was a position reserved for trusted officials in the kingdom. But in spite of that fact and the absence of any evidence of disobedience, Haman told the king that the Jews were a threat to him because of their laws. I think this is the first recorded instance of many, many times throughout history when the Jewish people have been falsely accused of not being loyal to the government under which they live, simply because they follow Jewish law in addition to the laws of the land. In today's language, this false charge is referred to as dual loyalty. And this allegation has been made against Jews everywhere, but against American Jews here who support the state of Israel as recently as this year. It was one of the charges that Hitler used against the Jews of Germany. It's been used throughout history. In response to Haman's false accusation, the king gave Haman authority to do whatever he wanted to do with the Jews. Chapter 3, verse 13 records the decree issued by Haman in which orders were given to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. 3 words for, killing them once wasn't enough. Destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews in the Persian Empire, from young to old, children and women, in one day on the 13th day of the month of Adar. That was yesterday. Chapter 4 begins by telling how Mordecai learned about the decree, his reaction to the decree, and the way he communicated with Esther through the eunuch to tell her what had been proclaimed. In his message to Esther, Mordecai told her she needed to go to the king and plead with him for the lives of her people. Well, Esther responded that to do so would put her life at risk because nobody was allowed to go to the king unless he had invited them. Mordecai's answer to Esther's resistance is recorded in chapter 4, verses 13 through 14. This is a quote. "Do not think that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life because you are in the king's palace. For if you keep silent, deliverance for the Jews will come from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Who knows if you have been brought to the palace for such a time as this?" That expression, "for such a time as this," is said so often today that I fear it may become commonplace, that it may be taken too lightly. So we need to let this admonition from Mordecai sink in and cause us to understand that we are where we are for a reason, and that reason is to act when necessary. Mordecai's words to Esther also contained a warning against having a false sense of security. No matter how comfortable we might be at the moment, even if we're living in a palace. Because in reality, we, Jews and Christians, both of us now, we are living in very perilous times. We must not think that we will be okay if we avoid confronting evil. Rather, we must realize that we have the responsibility to speak and act for the sake of what is right. We must respond as Esther did in chapter 4, verses 15 to 16, where she said, "I shall go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Well, chapter 5 begins with the story of how Esther goes to the king uninvited. She's accepted by the king, and she invites the king and Haman to a feast. The rest of chapters 5 and 6 are filled with an account that primarily focuses on Haman. We don't have time to talk about that today, but I encourage you to read it for yourself. So finally, we get to chapter 7, and Esther reveals to the king that her life is in danger, as are the lives of all her people. It is at this point that the king finds out for the first time that Esther is Jewish. Remember, Mordecai warned her not to reveal her true identity when she was first taken to the palace, but now it's necessary for her to do so in order for her to plead for the lives of her people. So after revealing that she's Jewish and that the fate of her people is her fate as well, Esther tells the king that it's Haman who's responsible for the fact that her people are to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. In a wonderful turn of events, Haman ends up being hung on a stake that he had prepared for Mordecai, and Mordecai was promoted by the king to the position Haman had held. Well, these are great developments, right? But there's still a problem, because even though Haman is dead, his decree to have all the Jews killed was still in effect. So in chapter 8, verse 5, it says that Esther begged the king to reverse Haman's decree. The king responded that according to Persian law, the decree cannot be changed. Instead, he gave Esther permission to write a second decree that would allow the Jews to defend themselves. In chapter 8, verse 11, it says, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and to stand for their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the army of the people or province and their adversaries. Do you hear the similarity in the wording of these two decrees? Remember, Haman's decree in chapter 3 called for the people of Persia to destroy, to kill, and annihilate the Jews. In Esther's decree, it says that the king allowed the Jews to assemble and stand for their lives and to destroy, to kill, and annihilate anyone who came against them. The three verbs that are used in both of these decrees, to destroy, kill, and annihilate, are identical in meaning, and they appear in the exact same form. The fact that they're identical means that the Jews were only allowed to do to their enemies what their enemies intended to do to them. In other words, they were only allowed to act in self-defense. And the fact that any actions the Jews took were defensive is made even more clear by the wording at the beginning of Esther's decree, where it says the king allowed the Jews to assemble and defend their lives. The form of that verb to assemble is a passive in the Hebrew. It's not an active verb. In other words, the Jews were not taking any aggressive action. They were assembling to take a position of defense, and as it says, to stand for their lives. Therefore, it's clear that Esther's decree only allowed for acts of self-defense against aggressors, in contrast to Haman's decree, which ordered the annihilation of the whole Jewish population. Therefore, if their enemies had not tried to kill them, the Jews would have had no cause to kill anyone. In other words, if no one tried to kill Jews, no one would have died. This is an extremely important point to make in light of how Jews have been falsely accused throughout history of being violent and bloodthirsty. Part of the foundation of anti-Jewish blood libels through the centuries are erroneous interpretations of the story of Esther found in Christian biblical commentaries and other theological works. Rather than correctly recognizing the actions of the Jews as defensive against those who tried to kill them, much of the historic interpretation of the book describes the Jews as a bloodthirsty people who initiated the killing and they enjoyed the killing. And then to put, they say, oh, they like to kill, and then they had a party to celebrate and eat. Too often in Christian history, that's been the interpretation of Esther. But a correct reading of Esther reveals that nothing could be further from the truth. And a correct understanding of the historical, cultural, and geographical context of the state of Israel also reveals that Israelis do not initiate or enjoy killing their enemies, but only do so in self-defense. The fact is that ever since before the founding of the Jewish state, it's not because of the Jewish state, like we hear in so much of the propaganda. It was before the founding of the Jewish state, Arabs have been killing Jews who live in the land. And then on the very first day of Israel's existence in 1948, 5 Arab nations from Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Iraq all invaded Israel for the purpose of destroying the newborn state. Ever since 1948, there have been repeated attempts on the part of the Arabs to kill Jews and destroy the Jewish state. Today, the security and existence of Israel is threatened by enemies on all of its borders. All of these enemies agree that Israel needs to be wiped off the map. Time after time, in multiple peace negotiations, Israel has offered to exchange land for peace. Time after time, the Arabs have refused the offers. Time after time, the Arabs have attacked Israel for the purpose of killing Jews and destroying the Jewish state. So time after time, Israel is forced to defend itself against attempted annihilation. Sound familiar? The reality is that Israel acts today just as the Jews of ancient Persia acted. Just as in the case of the Jews of Persia, if the enemies of Israel did not try to kill them, Israelis would have no cause to kill anyone. If no one tried to kill Israelis, no one would die. Israel desires to live in peace, just as the Jews of Persia did. And that's been expressed over and over by all of Israel's leaders. And now going back to Esther. The day came for Haman's decree to be carried out, and the enemies of the Jews attacked them. But because the Jews were allowed to defend themselves, according to Esther's decree, the Jews were victorious and were not destroyed. When the fighting was over, the text tells us that the Jews rested and celebrated their survival with feasting. They were not celebrating killing their enemies. They were celebrating their survival. The day they celebrated was the 14th day of the month of Adar, which is today, as I've said, on the Hebrew calendar. Chapter 9, verse 20 tells us that Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters throughout all the provinces of the Persian Empire, commanding the Jews to observe this holiday every year, and they have faithfully done so to this day. So I want to close by making some conclusions as to how all this applies to the issues I mentioned at the beginning, and then we're going to leave time for questions from the audience. I said that we would see why the holiday of Purim is relevant to the Christian faith. Why is it significant for Christians that Jews in the ancient Persian Empire were saved from extermination almost 500 years before the birth of Jesus? What does this have to do with Christians? The explanation is this. If the plan to annihilate all the Jews throughout the Persian Empire had been successful, the Jewish people would not have survived anywhere, including in the land of Judea. This is because the Persian Empire encompassed all the known world at that time. So if all the Jews of Judea had been annihilated, Jesus could not have been born as a Jew in Judea, which means that nothing about his life as we know it from the scriptures would have happened. In other words, no Jewish people, no Jesus. This is a relatively simple answer, but it's utterly profound in its implications. So in light of this reality, it's entirely appropriate for Christians to celebrate Purim because there would be no Christian faith without a Jewish Jesus born in Judea. Furthermore, celebrating this holiday with the Jewish people is completely consistent with what happened in the book of Esther itself. In chapter 8, verse 17, it says that when the Jews were celebrating after receiving the decree that would allow them to defend themselves, many non-Jewish people of the land joined with them. So again, it's entirely appropriate for non-Jews to celebrate the deliverance of the Jewish people from intended annihilation. I also said at the beginning that we would hopefully come to an understanding of the role we as Christians should play in a world where anti-Semitism continues to intensify and the state of Israel faces increasing opposition to its very existence. Let me bring in a bit of historical perspective. The attempted annihilation of the Jewish people in the time of the ancient Persian Empire was not unique. History tells us that the survival of the Jewish people has been threatened by successive empires since before the time of Esther and in every generation up to the present day. In addition, the Jewish people have suffered tremendous persecution at the hands of Christians throughout church history. We don't have time to go into detail at this point, but we need to say unequivocally that any Christian persecution of Jews is just plain wrong, scripturally, morally, ethically, historically. It should go without saying that Christians should be the first to defend and support the Jewish people and the Jewish state on biblical and moral grounds. We must be ready and willing to counter anti-Semitism, however and wherever it manifests, and defend Israel's right to exist and defend itself against all those who seek to destroy it. In particular, we need to counter Christian anti-Semitism and opposition to Israel that's rooted in erroneous theology and misguided concepts of, quote, peace and justice, all of which lead to actions such as boycotts, divestments, and sanctions that seek to weaken the Jewish state. To counter these threats to the security of Israel and the Jewish people, we as Christians must be equipped and prepared to counter the false theological and ideological foundations upon which Christian anti-Semitism and anti-Israel movements are founded. And I want to just conclude now with a few thoughts about what Esther and Purim teach us about the need to take action in the face of evil. Esther addresses the question of human responsibility when confronted by evil. In the case of Esther, the evil was the planned genocide of the Jewish people. Esther's actions are profoundly relevant to us today because in these times in which we live, we are going to increasingly find ourselves in situations that require us to make difficult decisions. And sometimes the right decision may even be accompanied by danger, as it was for Esther. So Esther challenges us to be willing to do the right thing, no matter what. The celebration of Purim teaches us that deliverance from evil was only possible after difficult, life-threatening actions were taken to counteract the destructive plans of Haman. Esther's decision to go to the king, even when it was against the law, was what was necessary in order for the second decree to be issued, the decree that allowed the Jews to defend themselves against murder. The deliverance of the Jewish people from certain death was primarily the result of the actions of one person. However, Esther wasn't completely alone because she did what she did in response to the admonition of Mordecai. So Esther teaches us that one person or two people working together can literally make the difference between life and death. We can all be an Esther or a Mordecai or both. We can and we must make a difference. It is a false hope to think that if we keep quiet in the face of evil, or just try to go along to get along, that we will somehow be safe. It doesn't work that way. All it takes for evil to win is for good people to do nothing. As the Jewish people know only too well, there are many Hamans in the world, in every generation. The question for us today is, will we be the Esthers and the Mordecais who are willing to step out of our false sense of security and take a stand for the sake of something that's much bigger than ourselves? So Dexter, we can go now to questions. We have some questions.
Yeah, that was just a wonderful presentation, Tricia. Thank you so much. And I guess I'm going to ask kind of a personal question, which is, how did your life change when you started to study Hebrew? And I know that's coming from nowhere, but that, you know, the one thing I keep seeing is it, you know, that people who study Hebrew, for some reason, their lives changed. Talk to me about that.
Well, Hebrew is the language from God, for one thing. It is the language that the Bible was written in. But for me, I guess it actually was the result of some other steps. It wasn't the very beginning, but what studying Hebrew did was put me in contact with or give me the ability to be able to really understand the biblical text. And that's why I started studying it. I'm not good at speaking it. I wish I were, but I wanted to read it. I wanted to be able to read the biblical text and understand it, because there's so many levels of meaning in the Hebrew that you don't get in the English, that you don't get in the translation. And it just brought me closer to the God of the Bible, and it brought me closer to the Jewish people, who are God's chosen people. But the reason I started studying Hebrew, if I can take a minute and just step back from that, is because through a long process of starting to study the Holocaust as a young adult, which I had not had in school, the question that drove me was, how did this happen in a Christian country? The Germans claimed to be Christians. They were mostly Catholics and Lutherans. So how did this happen? Because I grew up in a very philo-Semitic home. I had a lot of Jewish friends. My parents were pro-Israel. My grandmother, I did not know. I literally did not know that there was any such thing as Christian anti-Semitism. So when I started studying the Holocaust, that was my question. Like, well, how did this happen? Because none of the Christians I know would have let this happen, I would hope. I never heard anything anti-Semitic or anything in a church I went to growing up. So I was just like, obviously I grew up in a bubble, but I did. So I had to pursue that. And that's what led me to start studying. And the first thing I had to do was study Hebrew, because I had to understand the Hebrew Bible better.
All right. One of the things we just have a comment from Bob Bleakney saying, wonderful presentation. And I had written his name down just a few minutes before, because one of the things that I want to do is remind people of the names of some books that would be very helpful to equip themselves. And the first one I'm going to mention is Jews and Anti-Judaism in Esther and the Church. That's by Tricia Miller. She was today's speaker. And then there's The New Christian Zionism. That was edited by Jerry McDermott. And then he wrote another book called Israel Matters: Why Christians Must Think Differently About the People and the Land. And then there is by Bob Bleakney. Thank you, Bob. Evangelical Interpretation After Auschwitz: Planting Seeds for Responsible Deeds. And then there is another text that's a little bit older that you might have a difficult time, but it's an Israel study manual authored by Joanne Magnuson, who is one of our colleagues in another organization called NCLCI, a National Christian Leadership Conference for Israel. But I guess one of the things is that what can Christians do today? Because right now at camera, I don't want to say we're feeling under siege, but we work in a very busy environment these days. Because just recently, NBC, the Saturday Night Live, there was a joke on Saturday Night Live that basically invoked a blood libel against Israel by saying that they weren't giving vaccines for COVID-19 to non-Jews, which is a lie. And then there was another episode, I guess, a TV show called Nurses that basically portrayed Orthodox Jews in a very hateful manner. And then earlier today, I just logged on the internet, and it turns out that essentially Sweden did a report that said that there are significant numbers of Muslim immigrants to Sweden, particularly in Malmo, where people are essentially mad for Hitler, okay? And at a certain point, and Andrew Pessin, who's an expert in anti-Semitism, just recently tweeted something to the words the effect of, is it just me, or is there something wrong, but does it look like there's just an increased amount of anti-Israel invective on all fronts? And so what role do Bible-believing and responsible Christians have to help confront and change this environment?
Okay, well, I will answer that just a second. I want to add a book to your list. If I hold it up, I don't know, maybe it'll come out backwards in the camera.
Oh, it looks good.
Anyway, it's called The List. It just was published in 2019, and it's an account. It's very thick. It is over 500 pages, and it's a compilation of, so I'm reading from the back, a compilation of more than 800 atrocities committed by Christians, Christian nations, or in the name of Christ against the Jews over the last 2,000 years. Never before has this amount of research been compiled into a single volume by Christians for Christians. So I really recommend this. I've been starting to go through it. It's called The List: Persecution of Jews by Christians Throughout History. It's by Ray Montgomery and Bob Odell, and it's published by Root Source Press. And it was published in 2019. So that's one thing. Christians need to understand that there's this horrible, horrible history of Christian anti-Semitism and persecution of the Jews. That was the process I had to go through in studying the Holocaust. And where did all this come from? Because if we don't know our history, if we don't understand our history, we don't understand where things are moving. And unfortunately, things are moving in that direction again. The second thing that's most important, even before knowing the history, although we got to know that history, is we have to know our Bibles. Evangelical Christians, Bible-believing Christians have to know what the Bible says about Israel, about God's purposes for the Jewish people, and know that they have not been replaced in the purposes of God, which is the premise of replacement theology, which is the root of so much Christian anti-Semitism, so much the root of why the German church went along with Hitler. As I said, my driving motivation was I had to figure out what was wrong with those people in Germany, how they let this happen, because I realized if the Christians had done the right thing, the Holocaust couldn't have happened. So-called Christians far outnumbered Nazis. it didn't have to happen, but the church, for the largest part of the church, went along with it. There were a lot of good exceptions, and we know some of their names, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So, but the bottom line is we have to know what the Bible says. We have to understand that Christians are greatly indebted to the Jewish people. As Paul said in Romans 11, we've been grafted into the tree that's Israel. Israel's the root of the tree. We have to understand that all of our history is Jewish history. The first Christians, they didn't even call themselves Christians in the first century. They were Jews. It only got all messed up after the first couple centuries, when the church started teaching replacement theology and the need to separate from the Jews. So I keep mentioning things. You'll see here, I keep mentioning things that are history. We've got to know the history, and we've got to know what the Bible says. And then we'll be able to recognize error. We'll be able to, if you know the truth, then you can recognize error, and you can refute why replacement theology is wrong. And you can refute the things that are in the current propaganda that's trying to rewrite history and make a case for a Palestinian state in place of an Israeli state, etc. Is that, you want me to stop and you have more?
No, that's good.
Okay.
Now, one of the questions that I deal with, and you touched about on this in Esther, but one of the ideas that pops up in my head is that when we see people talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, what happens is that the hostility and the violence against Israel that precipitates or elicits an Israeli response isn't really acknowledged until after the Israelis respond. And what happens is that when Israelis respond with the use of force against, say, like the rioters in the Gaza Strip or rockets, Hamas rockets from the Gaza Strip, they won't talk about those rockets until after Israel has fired back. And then they'll say Israel responds. And it's like they make Israel the active player in this,
right,
this cycle of violence, when in fact it was initiated by Hamas or Israel's enemies. And what we see, from what I understand, is this notion that people even reinterpreted the book of Esther to make it look like the Jews were the aggressors. What's going on here?
Well, the way that Esther is used to validate that narrative that the Jews were the aggressor is because of translation issues. It's impossible to translate completely exactly from one language to another. There's always interpretation involved, because a word in Hebrew doesn't mean the exact same thing that we think of in English sometimes. In fact, in Hebrew, there can be multiple layers of meaning, which is what is so beautiful about the language. So things get misinterpreted or mistranslated, intentionally or unintentionally. So when you can go through all the English translations, and you'll find, like in chapters 8 and 9, you'll find translations that say the Jews avenged themselves, they took vengeance, things like that, where it's not a correct translation of the word. That's why I went through the effort I did in the presentation, just to explain the meanings of the words in Hebrew. They were allowed. They weren't like sent out. Like the king didn't say, "Go get them, guys." They were allowed to assemble and stand for their defense. They're all passive actions. They're just standing. They assembled, and that's why I said in the Hebrew, the verb assemble is passive. So it's passive. So this has got to be, and that's why I wrote the book that I did, because it has to be understood, because it's just as applicable now to Israel. Like you said, with all those examples, what the media does is they only report on what Israel does. Oftentimes they don't even report what was the provocation. And if they did, it's not usually the whole truth. Something's omitted, So what Christians need to do is look at as many news sources as you can, for one thing, to get the best picture. But the best source for the truth is camera. Our website we have everything on it. You can search for any topic, on any issue related to the Middle East, and specifically Israel and anti-Semitism and Christian issues, and you can find everything that's been written is factual and is based on a lot of research.
Okay, now one of the questions somebody posted, we didn't mention Constantine's Sword by James Carroll. And to be fair, that is a very good text. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that after James Carroll wrote that text, essentially, he kind of, I don't want to say that he became an anti-Zionist, but it's not as if he actually applied any of the lessons that he learned in writing that text to the current day conflict. And he's been very reluctant to address the issue of Muslim hostility or Islamic hostility towards Jews in Israel. And it seems as if there are some people get it only so far. You know, at a certain point, they will say, yes, we understand that Christian anti-Semitism is a problem, but this isn't really a factor in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And how do we get our point across to Christians who don't want to look at Islamic anti-Semitism or the role that religion plays in fomenting hostility towards Israel in the region?
Well, first of all, let me address how Christian anti-Zionism is identical to Christian anti-Semitism when the Christians involved are objecting to Israel's right to exist, and even what Israel does to defend itself. When they only see the Palestinian narrative and when they promote that is, I'm hoping I'm being clear. Let me be clearer. I'm not saying that any objection or any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. Israel's full of human beings. There's no perfect person and there's no perfect government. I'm not saying that nobody in Israel does anything wrong. What I am saying is that when Christians attack Israel for being a Jewish state, for claiming the right to that identity, and for defending themselves, that's anti-Semitism, because you can look at the arguments that are used, and they're the exact same arguments that have been used by anti-Semites throughout history. So that was one thing. And then the issue with Muslims, what did you want me to?
I just say, why is it hard for Christians oftentimes Christians who acknowledge the legitimacy of concerns about Christian anti-Semitism, why is it that they seem to be so reluctant to deal with the issue of Islamic, hostility towards Jews rooted in Islamic tradition? What's that about?
Well, if you're talking about Christians in the Middle East, a lot of time it's because of their dhimmi mentality that you talk so much about, and the fear of criticizing Islam or Muslims or sounding critical because they're in a more vulnerable position. But for the West, for Christians in the West, I'm afraid some of it at least has to do with this new woke culture that we are dealing with, and the feeling that you shouldn't say anything negative about anybody. But the problem with that is that Jews never get an exemption on that. They're still criticized, and anti-Semitism's on the rise. So it's a double standard. We have a real problem in our culture here in the West with not wanting to say anything about Islam or pointing out the problems. There is serious anti-Semitism in the Islamic world, and we're afraid to point it out.
Now, one of the interesting things that has taken place recently with the Abraham Accords is that it seems as if there were some leaders in the Middle East that have decided that, look, we're no longer really going to make hostility towards Israel the primary end-all, be-all source of our political and religious and cultural identity. We're not going to use it as a unifying agenda that we used it as before. And then yet at the same time here in the United States and in the West, we see Christian peacemakers that seem to be intent on maintaining their anti-Zionist stance. Mm-hmm. And it's almost as if they've become more anti-Israel than some of the actors in the region that have abandoned their anti-Zionism.
They are.
What's going on?
They are. They have a stake in what they've, sometimes we say follow the money, right? They have a stake in what they're doing. They're getting support. They're getting monetary support for what they're doing. But another thing is they've told the same story so long, maybe they're deceived themselves. Maybe they honestly really believe this. And I referred at one point in my presentation to the peace and justice movement. And I put those words in quotes because that's what they say, that they're for peace and justice. What they're doing is the antithesis. When they continue to portray Israel as the Goliath, and the poor Palestinians are the David that's being persecuted by the now stronger Israel, they are perpetuating a narrative that allows the Palestinians to remain intransigent. They allow the Palestinians to not be responsible for anything. And these so-called peacemakers, these Christian peacemakers, they're actually advancing the lack of peace because of that, because they're not presenting both sides. And so they do effectively come across as being anti-Israel.
Now, one of the things that you had talked about during your talk was you emphasized and you touched on briefly was Mordecai's identity as a Benjaminite and Haman's identity as an Agagite. And is there any relevance to that? And I guess what does that mean? Like, does it shed any light on what we need to think about today?
Yes. From the biblical history, these are ancient enemies, and the Jewish people, even today, identify current enemies of the Jewish people as Haman. For example, because it's the same kind of a spirit, the same kind of an intent to kill, to destroy, like Hitler was. But this animosity goes all the way back to when the Jews left Egypt and they're traveling through the desert, and the Amalekites attacked them from behind. They attacked the weaker members. They attacked people who were straggling, the old or the younger or whatever, that were straggling from behind. And so the writer we don't know who wrote the book of Esther, but the writer is clearly intending to make sure that the reader understands this historic animosity that's still there, because the Amalekites have always been the enemy. And God told the Israelites, never forget, don't forget what the Amalekites did to you when you were going through the wilderness. And that's why the Jewish people, they don't forget. They've been commanded not to forget. And so when Haman is introduced as an Agagite, that means he's descended from King Agag. That's the king that King Saul of the Israelites didn't exactly do what he was supposed to do according to the command of the prophet Samuel. So King Saul kind of didn't, finish the job, and he had a great excuse for why he did what he did. He ended up being removed from being king because of his disobedience. But now you've got Mordecai and Esther, because she's related to Mordecai. You've got Mordecai and Esther descended from, they're Benjaminites, so they're at least related to King Saul, whether they're a direct descendant or not. Anyway, they're of the same tribe. And so you have them pitted against Haman, who's the representative of the Amalekites. So this is showing you that this is going on for centuries. And the Jewish people would say, the rabbis, the interpretation's up to today. The interpretation is it's still going on.
Okay. I think we've got time for like one or two more questions. And I guess one of the questions is how, people are going to argue, look, the book of Esther was written thousands of years ago. How is it that you can actually use it as a template or a way to analyze current events today? And I guess, and we need to be careful. I understand that, but what about the people who say, look, this is just kind of, and I don't mean to sound sacrilegious, but some sort of folktale. Is there? But you seem to argue that this actually is a reliable depiction of the structure of Jewish experience, so to speak, to borrow a phrase. Is there something about the human condition that it elucidates?
Well, for one thing, human nature never changes. Human nature has been the same from the beginning. So it doesn't matter how old the story is. There's principles that are that are completely applicable. And Jews and Christians historically, they've been interpreting scripture the Jews have been doing it a lot longer than Christians have. But both faiths have been interpreting scripture and getting lessons from the scripture. So whether it's, what would you say, a folktale, whether it's a folktale or whatever, there would still be lessons. However, I argued in my book, there's a whole chapter on the historical accurateness of feature after feature after feature of the text. So I personally argued that it is historical, that it's in an historical setting that is completely clear. In chapter 1, for example, they give the description of the garden and the color of the tile, and et cetera, et cetera. That's been uncovered archaeologically in Susa. So, I mean, that's just one of many, many things. But historically, the timing, the events, the length of the banquet, and then when the king was gone, and then when Esther, all of those things, I went into, it took a whole chapter, so I'm not going to do it now, but all of those events line up historically. Not to mention the Greek historians who wrote about this king, who they called Xerxes.
Right. So, all right, just one last question. It seems as if in this modern era, we're dealing with social media. It seems as if every time we see a huge advance in communications technology, that somehow some of the first people that get to that new technology are people who use it to assail the Jewish people. Hitler, he basically figured out how to use the radio and use radio broadcasts to demonize Jews, and Leni Riefenstahl's movie. How do Christians, what's our obligation in this modern world to help confront that? How do we deal with that? And maybe, I don't know the answer to that, so it may be an unfair question.
Well, Christians need to be involved in every platform, in every media, everywhere they can be involved. We are not to pull back. We are not to shrink back. We are to be involved. What if, that's part of what I said. What if Esther hadn't done what she had done? We have to be involved. So Christians have to figure out a way to counter everything. I'm not a tech person, so I can't give you, specific answers. But the principle is we have to be involved in everything. Christians need to be involved in government, in culture, and everywhere to push back against what is happening in the world.
All right. Well, with that, I just want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. And I also want to thank the support that CAMRA has given Dr. Miller and I over the years. And I also want to thank our supporters who've actually donated to CAMRA over the years, because we do crucial work. We push back. We are Mordecai and Esther in modern day form. And the people that we work with, they've done phenomenal work, and we will continue to do the phenomenal work on behalf of the truth and do what we must to provide a defense of the modern state of Israel and the Jewish people. And before I close out, I want to thank Patrick Fox, because he's been doing the tech work in an awful lot of these webinars, and he's done a lot of work on these. And these webinars are a crucial element of the pushback against anti-Zionism. So I want to wish everyone a happy Purim and a good Lent, and thank you so much.